Hello everybody, this is week 4 of the June 2021 Year 10 mock preparation. So as we already know, we are preparing for a 90-minute exam. Now 60 of those minutes are going to be on Germany and we've already done the revision on those sections and you should have your lovely big A3 grids. What we're doing today is we're having a look at Elizabeth and the two parts that are going to be examined on her. So here's our little checklist. What we've done so far, obviously, is every week we're doing revision based on one of these 4 areas. So we've done Kaiser and early Weimar Germany, we've done Hitler coming to power, we've done controlling Nazi Germany. If you haven't done any of those sections, you absolutely need to get caught up on those. Go to the TCA History YouTube channel and do that as soon as possible, please. This week, as I've already said, the 7th to the 12th of June is looking at Elizabeth. Next week, we're going to be going over all of the topics a second time to make sure that we've got that content in our minds ready for Monday the 21st of June and the beginning of our mocks. So we should have the technique down now in terms of what we're doing for our homeworks over this session. We're going to obviously listen to all of the stuff that you've got to do and fill in the appropriate boxes. I'll make it really, really clear to you which box you're filling in at what point. If you do not have the actual grid, it doesn't matter. You can do it on any piece of paper. Do not see being absent as a reason not to do this homework. This homework has to be done whether you were in class or not, because whether you were in class or not, you are going to be doing the mock. So it's really important that you get yourself as prepared as possible. Now, both questions on Elizabeth are quite simple knowledge question that requires you to write 2 paragraphs about something. So the first question you're going to be introduced to this week is explain what was important about. So as it says here, this is a really simple question and requires you to demonstrate understanding of consequences and include detailed own knowledge to support. So it might be explain what was important about. Think about the 2 topics we're looking at today. We're looking at the Essex Rebellion and we're looking at marriage. So it could be explain what was important about marriage. It could be explain what was important about the Essex Rebellion. All you need to do is talk about the knowledge to do with those things and the impact and the consequences that they had over time, both at the time and over a longer period of time. As you can see, you're filling in that top left box here. So here's what you need to be recording now. This is the actual technique to this question. So explain what was important, about 8 marks. This is about something you take about 12 minutes on, so about 6 minutes per paragraph. So you're going to be given a question to answer, which will always start with explain what was important about blah, blah, blah. So as we said, it could be Elizabeth's decisions regarding marriage. It could be about the Essex Rebellion. This question requires you to talk about the consequences and include detailed own knowledge, as we've already said. You need to talk about at least 2. You might actually have time to talk about a 3rd thing, explain what was important about. So you might better divide it into 3 rather than 2 areas. It really doesn't matter. If you were talking about 2, though, you'd have to do it in a little bit more depth and detail. So the structure of this, well, your first paragraph would be writing about a first consequence. So a first impact of whatever it is you're talking about. So a first impact of Elizabeth's decisions regarding marriage, or a first impact of the Essex Rebellion, and lots of detailed knowledge about that. Then your second paragraph would just be a repeat of a second one. If you're struggling to think about what you could be writing about, you could divide it into short and long-term consequences. And that's always a nice way to kind of divide this question up. It's very similar to the question that you answer on Nazi Germany as well. So here's a couple of examples of the kind of things that you could write about if you were answering and explain what was important about question based on the 2 topics that we're having a look at. So imagine the question was something about explaining the importance of marriage. You might begin with thinking about 2 reasons why marriage was important. Marriage is extremely important as this could solve the issue of succession and create alliances. Elizabeth was expected to marry because you talk all about succession, heirs, etc. You might then talk about how that was difficult and why that was difficult. You might talk about her relationship with Parliament. You might then go on maybe in a second paragraph to talk about those alliances. You might talk about both foreign alliances and alliances within England and creating that kind of system of patronage, etc. If you're answering a question about the importance of the Essex Rebellion, You might say the Essex Rebellion was important as it demonstrated a deteriorating relationship with the Privy Councillors and a weakening in Elizabeth's rule. So you might show how Elizabeth deteriorated in terms of her strength and her power over time, and in particular in relation to the Privy Council. Elizabeth relied on her Privy Councillors to be loyal. However, in 1601, and of course you could talk about some of the impacts of the events of the Essex Rebellion. Our second exam question this week is write an account of. Now this is a lovely question. This is a question that requires you to have detailed knowledge of the events and how they or their impact changed over time. So you might talk about the event in the short term as it was happening and then over the longer term as well. Sometimes in these kind of questions it's nice to show, well, what was the cause of an event, what were the actual events itself, and what were the impacts over time and at the time itself. You could divide it up in that way. Again, you need to make sure that you're making notes in the appropriate box, which here is the top middle box. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail. So write an account of is another 8-mark question. So both Elizabeth questions are 8 marks. So you're going to be given a question to answer, which will always start with write an account of. So of course this week it will be write an account of Elizabeth's decisions regarding marriage or Elizabeth and marriage, or write an account of the Essex Rebellion. This question requires you to show detailed knowledge and of course, as I've already said, show the impact and how that changed over time. They want you to discuss the outcome, how things developed, and how Elizabeth or Elizabethans dealt with those issues. So remember that Elizabeth did rule for a long time. Obviously, if it's something like the Essex Rebellion, you're going to talk about it more in a shorter term because obviously that happened in 1601. You need to talk about at least 2 parts of the story, but you could easily break it down into 3. As I said on the last slide, you could break it down into kind of causes, events, and impacts. That would be really good as long as you're making sure that each of the paragraphs was linking back to the question. So paragraph 1, write about a first area and how that changed. Paragraph 2, do the same for a second. Just like with that first 8-mark question, around 12 minutes for this. So again, let's have a look at the kind of examples that you could be using in this particular exam. So if there was a question about writing an account of Elizabeth's decisions regarding marriage, you might begin with the beginning of her reign. So at the beginning of her reign, Elizabeth was expected to marry, many suitors were presented. So you might talk about kind of those early hopes and the early kind of suitors, etc. And then your second paragraph might be kind of the later stages, maybe including the role of Parliament and the Privy Council. However, if the question was about the Essex Rebellion, this would actually be a really nice one to divide up because you could really talk about where it went wrong with Essex, the breakdown in the relationship, and the causes of the rebellion. All of that stuff, you know, there's quite a lot to talk about there. You might then talk about the actual events itself on that particular rebellion, and then you might look at, well, what was the impact? How big a challenge was that to Elizabeth? So I'm now going to talk you through the knowledge that you'll need to do for the Elizabeth questions. So this isn't masses and masses of information. I'm going to talk for about 8 to 9 minutes on each of the 2 topics. So about 8 to 9 minutes on marriage, why that was so important and all the kind of various parts about what was going on there, and also about 8 to 9 minutes about the events of the Essex Rebellion. You're only going to have to listen to about 15 minutes of me talking, but obviously after every single section, you need to pause and complete the boxes. So take care now that you're filling in the correct box. The box that we're filling in at the moment is the one on the top right. This is the box where we're looking at reasons why Elizabeth really should have married. So there's some really obvious reasons. The first really obvious reason why Elizabeth needed to marry was there needed to be a clear successor, and obviously, preferably, a son. We know that Henry having daughters had been a problem. Really, the succession was only sorted when he had his son. There was an issue that could descend into civil war if Elizabeth died, because there'd be different branches of the family fighting over who actually had the most right to control. And that had happened in real recent history with the War of the Roses. And obviously that ended up being a success for the Tudor family. But the Tudors could just as easily be removed now if Elizabeth did not create a clear successor. Another reason why she should marry is how people viewed women at this time. So during this period, women were considered weak. They weren't obviously going to be fighters, and they were seen as not capable of ruling a nation. Women were seen as mothers and nurturers rather than being people who could make tough decisions. What many people felt, including many within Parliament and many within the Privy Council, was that marriage would bring stability to the country because people would feel settled. That, number one, there's more likely to be an heir now, and number two, there would be a man to help guide Elizabeth. Another really good reason for marriage at this point in time would be that actually marriage was a way of brokering and making alliances with other countries. Many marriages in the past had been this. Obviously, Henry VIII himself had married a Spaniard in his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, in order to make that alliance with the very powerful Spain. Elizabeth's sister, Mary, had been married to the King of Spain. All of this would give you a partner abroad to help you in times of trouble, to support you, trading links, all sorts. If you chose to marry within the country, it would also maybe allow you to match up with a very strong noble family that would make you even stronger too. So these were all really good reasons. But there was also an additional reason at this time, and this was to do with religion. So if you remember, Henry had broken away from the church in Rome, the Catholic Church, in the 1530s. Since that time, England had gone through Protestantism, but it had also swung back to Catholicism under Mary. Elizabeth's role was also seen as being the protector of this new Christian religion, Protestantism. So one of the things that people wanted her to do was leave that legacy of being a monarch who had saved Protestantism, and it would continue after her death, and we wouldn't be plunged back into another change in religion. Make sure you pause the video now and jot down those notes in that top right box. We're now in the bottom left box. So why was marriage such a problem then? Well, for Elizabeth, she had, she wanted to rule and reign. She wanted to be the person who actually made the decisions. And being married would limit her personal freedom. She would have to share power with her husband. Men were seen as superior at this time, and so anybody that ruled alongside her would in many ways be seen as more powerful as her. And she may get pushed a little bit to the side in terms of decision making. And Elizabeth did not want to do that. Remember, she had a real fierce intellect. She was someone who was absolutely capable of ruling and didn't want to hand that over just because she was a woman. Another reason why there was massive problems at this time was, as I said on the last slide, they wanted Elizabeth to marry to preserve the Protestant religion. But most candidates, most suitable people out there were Catholics. That meant it was going to be very difficult for her to marry them, because what would then happen to the children? Were the children going to be Protestant or Catholic? So the religion was also a real problem into marriage. It could secure Protestantism, but there weren't that many Protestant candidates, particularly from outside of the country. Another issue was, if Elizabeth chose to marry, for example, someone from Spain, that might upset the French, or it might upset other countries within Europe. So it was going to be difficult to pick the right nation, a nation that was both Protestant and that wouldn't upset other countries too much. If Elizabeth chose someone from one particular country, other countries might feel snubbed and overlooked. Another reason why marriage was going to be a problem was, obviously the country expected her to marry, and they expected her to marry well. But when Mary I had married Philip of Spain, a foreigner, that had caused the Wyatt's rebellion. Philip of Spain was not popular, and he treated Mary badly. He was an absent husband, and therefore the reflections and the views of the British people, the English people rather, on marrying a foreigner weren't very good. However, another reason why Elizabeth struggled with marriage was, it would be good to marry an English husband, but that might unbalance the different groups at the royal court. Remember that Elizabeth used patronage, and she kept playing off the powerful families against one another. If she chose one of them, maybe some of the other families wouldn't be quite as loyal to her. Elizabeth's own experience of marriage was not positive. Henry VIII, her father, had killed 2 of his wives, including Elizabeth's mother. So she had not seen many examples of successful marriages. And of course, her beloved stepmother, Catherine Parr, had died in childbirth, or died after having a child. So her view of marriage was marred by some of those things. Elizabeth herself as well claimed that she was married to her country. She declared that she didn't really need it and refused to name a successor. And naming a successor could have put her life in danger, as others upset about that might try and challenge her. So make sure again you pause the video and make some notes from this slide. So what was Elizabeth's response to the problem of marriage? Well, she hesitated. She was usually a very decisive person, but she kept people guessing at home and abroad. Now, that was quite a clever game, but it also led to a huge amount of frustration and irritation from people both within and outside of the country. It also led to a dispute with both Parliament and the Privy Council, as they tried increasingly to press her to marry. So she, of course, became queen in 1558 at the age of 25. She still had some good years ahead. By 1566, they were still pressuring her nearly 10 years into her reign. She'd been on the throne for 8 years at this point. But she lost her temper because they kept trying to raise this issue. From this point onwards, from 1566, she banned Parliament from talking about it. This was her business, not the business of the country. Parliament, of course, massively disagreed because this was all linked to the issue of succession. She did consider a number of suitors over the years. She did, but I never think actually seriously consider Philip II of Spain. Number one, because he'd been married to her sister and not a very good husband. And number two, he was quite old. And of course, he was Catholic. She did consider Robert Dudley, but unfortunately, he was already married. And then when his wife died, it was in mysterious circumstances. So he was kind of a no-go area. And the last serious suitor was Francis of Anjou, and he was the younger brother of the King of France. And again, despite the fact that she seemed to consider him, by this point, she was already really past childbearing age for the time. She used marriage as a diplomatic tool. She was able to do this for the first 15 to 20 years of her reign. Negotiations were a tool in foreign policy. So when she was negotiating about a possible marriage with the Duke of Anjou, that meant relations with France improved at that time. So she used this as a carrot to dangle in front of foreigners that perhaps if they made a good trade deal with her, that she might actually marry them. However, by the time she reached her 50s, and it was clear that she was never going to marry and have children, she had this status, this cult status as the Virgin Queen, and she wasn't likely to ever change it from that point onwards. So fill in that bottom middle box now, please. So by the end of Elizabeth's reign, the succession crisis, i.e. who was going to take over after her death, had resolved itself, almost by accident. And this was because the eligible contenders had died. Elizabeth chose James VI of Scotland, first of England, sixth of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, but kept delaying until right at the end of her life. After she died, succession ran very, very smoothly because many branches of Elizabeth's family, as it says here, had already died off. But succession had been a key question hanging over Elizabeth's reign for the entire 45 years. Make sure you pause now and fill in that final box on the front of your sheet. We're now on the back of our sheet and we're looking at Essex Rebellion. So remember, the Essex Rebellion is all about the uprising of Robert Devereux, who was the Earl of Essex. So he was someone who had been on Elizabeth's Privy Council. He was seen as a war hero. He was young. Elizabeth thought he was very, very dashing, and he'd been a little bit of a favourite of hers. But that favouritism had actually led to quite a lot of problems. So in the 1590s, Elizabeth's trusty Privy Council had begun to die off. And what this created was a bit of a power vacuum. And jealousy between Devereux, Essex, and the Cecils really built up throughout the 1590s. Essex wanted to be the most important minister. He wanted really to be like the old Cecil. He wanted to be the man that Elizabeth went to with all her troubles. But William Cecil, until 1598, was still alive. So he was blocking Essex's ambitions, as was his son, Robert. When William died, Robert was made her new head of state. This absolutely enraged and infuriated Essex, and this really led to a breakdown in their relationship. But what it demonstrated was that Elizabeth had not been using the system of patronage as effectively as before. Under the old Privy Council, even when there were rivals like Dudley and Cecil, they still worked together for what was best for the Queen and the country. Robert Cecil and Essex didn't do that. They were really more out for themselves, especially Essex. And that links to the second point about Essex. Essex was incredibly arrogant. He knew he was very charming. He knew that Elizabeth kind of quite fancied him. He knew that she would kind of forgive him everything. So when he was originally banned from court, he, after he'd asked her to promote some of his supporters, he insulted her. Her conditions are as crooked as her carcass, i.e. he was saying that she was disgusting looking and she was also crooked too. She promoted people that she wanted rather than people with ability. And remember, in the Privy Council, when he wasn't getting his way, he turned his back on her, which was a massive, massive insult. You don't do that to the Queen. So because she didn't put him in his place quite enough at this point, this was a cause of the rebellion, because of course she forgave him for this and she sent him to Ireland. This was another key mistake. When he was sent to Ireland, he was meant to be crushing a rebellion. So she gave him this second chance. Even after he'd done that, turning his back on her, insulted her, she hoped that she could, get him back onto the side of righteousness. So when she asked him to crush this rebellion, he actually made peace with the Irish. But whilst he was there, it cost huge amounts of money for him to be there. And he was there for months and months. He didn't really communicate with Elizabeth back home. He didn't send any word of what was happening. Lots and lots of his soldiers died of all sorts of horrible diseases. And he returned to England and was given another important job. He found out that Robert Cecil had been given another important job when he got back. So he's come back, he feels that he's done a really, really good thing. Rather than going to war, he's created peace with Ireland. He expects to be congratulated. Now, I don't really know how he expected to be congratulated because he'd gone against direct orders. But he'd come in, he'd gone, I'm a hero, and Robert Cecil has been given more. So this is the bit where he burst in on her before she was wigged and gowned. Remember, that was not a lovely sight. At this point, he was put under house arrest. He lost all his government jobs, so he wasn't on the Privy Council anymore. And very importantly for his money, that monopoly on sweet wines. So remember, he was the only person in the country with a licence to do that. And that meant he was able to make fortunes. This loss of power, status, all of that, plus his ability to make money, was the final straw, the very last thing that caused it. So if we're thinking about, well, what's the background to the rebellion? Well, it's that jealousy over that favouritism, that competition between the two, his own personal arrogance and feeling that he could be forgiven anything, and the fact that he then ignored her in Ireland and then came back and felt that he had the right to burst in on her. We're now on the bottom box on the sheet and we're looking at the events. Well, we know that he wanted to remove Robert Cecil. So Robert Cecil has become even more powerful whilst Essex has been away in Ireland. So what he did, remember, he's under house arrest. He's lost his status. He's lost his monopoly. He now gathered up 300 supporters. These people were others, unsuccessful courtiers, people who tried to gain favour with the Queen and failed, disgruntled soldiers. He began to fortify his mansion to make it very difficult for anybody to burst in. When Elizabeth heard that, something was going on here, she ordered 4 members of her Privy Council to go and arrest Essex, but he arrested them instead and took them hostage. And this was a signal to start the rebellion. So he began the rebellion and marched to London. He hoped that many Londoners would support him, but nobody gained his little band of men. He had underestimated how the people of the country felt about Elizabeth. They didn't really care about how he was treated when he got back from Ireland. They didn't really care that he was under house arrest. He was a popular figure, but not more popular than the Queen. This is where that overreaching and arrogance really comes to play. He then decided to march to the Queen's Palace at Whitehall. He intended to capture Elizabeth, but failed. Robert Cecil labelled Essex as a traitor and said that anyone who deserted him would be pardoned. This was a really, really clever thing to do because many of the rebels then dropped out of the march. They're like, oh, this isn't going to work anymore. We've kind of lost too much already. And they backed out. So he had now fewer supporters. So Essex then returned to his home thinking, aha, now I can deal with the hostages. But the hostages had been released. Elizabeth's government arrested Essex and his remaining supporters. The rebellion itself lasted just 12 hours. So it wasn't a massive uprising, at its most 300 people. This time round, many times when Elizabeth faced challenge, she kind of wondered what to do with the rebels. No wondering here. Essex was beheaded. Several of the rebels were executed too, although some escaped with a fine. Elizabeth made it clear now that she would not tolerate challenges. So this was an important rebellion because it was one of her key privy councillors, but it never really threatened her. Our final box now then in the top right, make sure you pause this at the end to make sure you can fill in the correct bits. So how serious was this threat? Well, there was a real lack of popular support. Remember, they marched through the streets of London. They don't gather any more supporters. But her authority over the court had become weaker. The fact that some courtiers and one of her privy councillors was actually willing to rise up against her and actually try and take her throne showed that patronage was not being used as effectively as before. Her government had become less and less effective. What you got was this constant competition and infighting, and it made it more difficult to get decisions and things done. So this demonstrated a weakening of her power over time. So yes, this actual rebellion was never really going to take her down, but it did represent that she was not the queen that she had been in the past. It also showed that her privy council was not what it had once been. Pause and fill in the final box. So you now have revision sheets on all of the following: the Kaiser, Weltpolitik, and the Anglo-German naval race. On early Weimar, economic and political problems, both of those were filled in week 1. Hitler coming to power, including the Great Depression, the weakness of the Weimar, that was week 2. Week 3 was how Hitler controlled Germany through terror and propaganda. And this week was Elizabeth, marriage, and the Essex Rebellion. So next week, we're going to be putting it all together. So feel free to go back and look at any of the revision videos again. So next week, we're going to be using the sheets to make sure that you know the content. You can start that process whenever you're ready. You don't have to wait until next week because there are a number of areas, of course, that you need to be revising and making sure that you've got really good knowledge on before the 21st of June.